Hi there, I'm Carmen from Minerva, and today we are going to be sewing the Melilot shirt from Deer and Doe patterns together in this beautiful viscose challis fabric. I know that sewing a button-up shirt can seem really scary sometimes. There's a lot of details, the collar, the buttons, the button placket, all those things can seem scary, but I promise it does not have to be as scary as it seems. So today I'm going to take you step by step through sewing the Melilot shirt so that you can feel confident to tackle a button-up shirt for yourself as well. Now, if you want to make yourself a shirt just like the one that I am making today, then all of the products that I use to make this shirt will be tagged down below this video, so you can go ahead and check those out. And you can even hover over the products and then click Add All to Cart if you want to get the whole thing as a kit so that you can make the same shirt for yourself. So hopefully that helps you to not have to search for all of these things in order to make a shirt like the one I'm making today. So let's get started. So before we do anything else, we need to start with sizing because that is super important to get a good fit for your shirt. So you need to make sure that you take your measurements and compare those with the sizing chart and make sure that you choose the correct size for your body measurements. So for this pattern, you're going to need your bust, waist, and hip measurements, and you can take those in either inches or centimeters. They have their sizing chart in both, so whichever one you prefer. So you're going to want to take your bust measurement around the widest part of your bust, your waist measurement around the smallest part of your waist, and your hip measurement around the widest part of your hips. So I definitely recommend that you take these measurements in either the undergarments that you plan to wear when you wear the shirt, or take your measurements with close-fitting garments over your undergarments. So for example, leggings and a close-fitting tank top or t-shirt. I'm going to just show you with the clothes I'm wearing today where to take the measurements, but I do recommend when you take your measurements to take them with close-fitting garments or just in your undergarments so that you can get a more accurate measurement. But like I said, I just want to show you where to take your measurements, so I'm just going to go ahead and show you that now. Alright, so I've got my measuring tape here, and I'm going to show you where you're going to want to take your measurements for this pattern. So first you want to take your bust measurement, which like I said is around the widest part of your bust. And if you have trouble, you might need to get a friend to help you hold the tape measure up, but I'm just going to do it here on my own. So I'm just going around the widest part of my bust, right over the apex of my bust, and then in a straight line around my back. Now for the waist, you're going to go around the smallest part of your waist and record that measurement. Once again in a straight line all the way around. And then for my hips, I'm going to go around the widest part of my hips, which is not where your hip bones are up here. This is going to be right around the fullest part of your bum. So right around your bum, and then in a straight line. And then record that measurement. So once you've taken your measurements, then write those down, and then you can use those to pick your size. So that's where we're headed next, to pick the size that we're going to cut in the pattern. Alright, so here's the sizing chart for the pattern. So what you want to do is decide which size is the closest to your measurement for each of the three areas, the bust, waist, and hip. And it's okay if you are closer to a different size at each of the three measurements. We can adjust for that when we cut out the pattern. So the most important thing is to check your measurements against the measurements in the size chart, figure out for those three areas which size you fall closest to, and then write that down. So for example, my bust measurement was 37.5 inches. So 37.5 inches falls closest to a size 42 for the bust measurement. For my waist, it was 32 inches, which falls closest to a size 44. And for my hip, it was 42 inches, which also falls closest to a size 44. So I know that when I cut out my pattern, I'm going to need to alter the pattern to adjust from a size 42 at the bust up to a size 44 at the waist and hip. So I've got my pattern here, and now I need to cut out my pattern pieces. So I'm going to be making version A of the shirt, which is the long-sleeved version with the hidden button placket. So for this version, I'm going to need to cut out pieces 1 through 9. So piece 10 is the only piece that is needed for version B that is not needed in version A. So I'm going to cut out pieces 1 through 9, and since my sizing is going to need to be adjusted, I am going to just roughly cut out the main front and main back pieces. Rather than cutting directly on the size lines, I'm just going to cut around the pieces just to get them apart from the other pieces, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to adjust the sizing before cutting those all the way out. But all of the other pieces are above the waist, so they don't need to be adjusted for sizing. So for all the pieces except the main front and main back panels, I'm going to be cutting a size 42. Alright, so I have pieces 3 through 9 cut out in a size 42, which is the size that corresponds to my bust measurement. And I've also cut out the front and back pieces roughly around all the lines, leaving all the size lines in place so that I can adjust the sizing before cutting along any of the lines. So that's what I'm going to show you now, how to adjust the size of the front and back pieces to adjust for your measurements. Alright, so I'm going to start with the back piece, and what you're going to need for this is a pen or pencil and a French curve ruler. And if you don't have a French curve ruler, you can definitely just freehand the curve as well. So what we need to do is find the size 42 line at the underarm area and the size 44 line at the waist. And I'm just going to draw a nice curve connecting the size 42 up to the size 44 at the waist. So all you need to do is find the size that you are at the bust, connect that to the size that you are at the waist, and then if you have another different measurement for your hip measurement, then you would connect the size you are at the waist to the size that you measured at the hip, and just connect the points with a nice curve. So now when I cut this piece out, all I'm going to do is cut everything above the underarm area where the top of that line that we drew in starts is going to be cut at a size 42, and everything below the line that we just drew down towards the hip area is going to be cut in a size 44. And when we get to that line, just going to cut along the new line that we drew to connect the two sizes. And now it's time to do the exact same thing with the front piece. So for my measurements, I'm just going to connect the size 42 at the underarm area right below that dart to a size 44 at the waist. So for you, just connect whatever sizes corresponded to your measurements, just like you did with the back. And then it's just time to cut this last pattern piece out the same way that we cut out the back pattern piece. Alright, so now it's time to cut out all our pieces from the fabric. So for piece 1, you're going to want to cut 2 pieces out of fabric. For piece 2, which is the back, you're going to cut 1 on the fold. For piece 3, you're going to cut just 1. For piece 4, also just 1 out of the fabric. For piece 5, you're going to want to cut 2 on the fold. For piece 6, also 2 on the fold. For piece 7, which is the sleeve, you're going to want to cut 2. For piece 8, you can cut 2 out of the fabric. And for piece 9, you're going to want to cut 4. And you're also going to want to cut some interfacing. So for interfacing, you're going to want to cut 2 of piece 9, as well as 1 of piece 5 and 1 of piece 6. And then you're also going to want to cut 2 3/4 inch wide strips for the interfacing the plackets. So 3/4 inch wide strips that are long enough to cover the entire length of the shirt. So at least 27 inches should give you a good amount to work with. Now you can go ahead and add in all your pattern markings, and one important thing to note is that for version A, on the fronts, the right front is longer than the left front. This is for the hidden button placket, so what we need to do once we add in all those lines at the center fronts, then the left front needs to be cut along that second line where on the pattern it indicates that the version A left front should end. So I'm going to draw in all my lines, and then I'm just going to cut the left front but not the right front along that second line in to make it shorter than the right front. Next, to finish prepping your pieces, you'll need to apply your interfacing to 2 of the sleeve cuff pieces, as well as 1 of the collar pieces and 1 of the collar stand pieces. Alright, we're finally ready to get sewing. So the first thing we need to do is grab our right front pattern piece, which is going to be the longer of the 2 front pieces, and lay it on your table with the wrong side facing up. And then we need to fold in the center front along the line that's the furthest in from the edge, and fold it in with wrong sides together, and then press it with your iron. So I've got it all pressed and pinned, and then we just need to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a seam 3/4 of an inch from that folded edge. So I've got that seam sewn, and here's what it looks like. So now let's turn it to the right side so that we can see what it looks like from the right side. And now we can pull that raw edge from underneath out towards the center front again, and that's going to form that nice flap that's going to cover our button placket, which forms the hidden button placket. At this point, it's also a good idea to give everything a nice press to keep everything nice and flat. Next, we need to apply our interfacing strips to the front pieces to stabilize the button placket areas. So on the right front, which is the one we just formed the hidden placket flap on, we're going to place the strip of interfacing on the wrong side of the front, right along that seam line we just sewed. So it's basically right underneath that flap that we just sewed and pressed towards the front. And for the left front piece, we're going to apply our interfacing right over where the buttons will go. Alright, so I have my interfacing strips added, and now we need to start forming the plackets. So we're going to fold the plackets in along the lines that we've drawn on from the pattern and fold them in towards the wrong side. So on the right front, which is the one with the hidden placket flap, there is a smaller fold along that outside edge, which we're going to fold it in along that first line, and then fold it in again, and then pin that in place, and just do that all the way up, and then pin and press everything in place. Now for the left front, there's a larger fold at the beginning, and then one more large fold to fold it up over the interfacing. And same thing, we're just going to fold it in, press it, and pin it. So I've got my plackets all pressed and pinned, and the next step is to take these to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to sew as close to that inner folded edge as I possibly can to secure these plackets in place. So I'm just going to be stitching a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch from that inner folded edge, not the outer folded edge, but the one closest to the inside of the pattern piece. And that's just going to secure everything in place. Next, it's time to sew our darts to get a little bust shaping for this shirt. So you're going to want to make sure that you've drawn in the dart lines from the pattern according to your size. And I already have my lines drawn in here, but I'm just drawing them in a little bit darker so that you can see it better because my blue chalk was not showing up very well on camera. So once you have your dart lines drawn in from the pattern, then you're just going to want to fold the dart right sides together and line up each side of the dart, line up those lines. I like to line them up by sticking a pin through the line on one side and making sure that the pin goes through the line on the other side because that'll tell me that they are matched up. And then just pin them right sides together, matching up the lines, and then stitch that wedge-shaped dart in place. And of course, repeat this process with the other front so that you have a dart on both sides. And now that my darts are sewn in, I'm just going to give these a good press, and I'm going to press the darts down towards the bottom of the shirt. Next, it's time to tackle the pocket. So you're going to want to grab your pocket lining and your pocket piece, and you just need one of each. I did cut 2 of each, and that was just because it was easier than unfolding the fabric to only cut 1. But I'm just going to grab out 1 of each and then just set aside the others. And then just pin the pocket lining to the pocket piece with right sides together, lining up the lower curved portions. And then stitch them together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And once you've got them sewn together, you can trim down the seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch, which is just going to help reduce bulkiness in the pocket seams. And then it's ready to turn right sides out and then take it to the ironing board so we can press everything nice and flat. So with my iron, first I'm just going to make sure and press everything nice and flat, make sure that I have my seams all pulled out so that everything is looking good. And once I've done that, then I'm going to fold down the top of the pocket piece where the raw edge is and fold it down so that it just meets the top of the pocket lining piece, lining up the 2 raw edges. And then I'm going to fold it down one more time, which will encase all the raw edges inside and form a nice, clean, rolled finish. And then I'm just going to press that, pin everything in place, and then take it to my sewing machine and sew right along that lower folded edge to secure everything in place. So I've got my pocket all nice and sewn and ready to go on my shirt. So let's grab the left front piece, which is the side that the pocket goes on for version A. And I'm just going to lay the front piece with right sides facing up, and then I'm going to pin the pocket to the front piece following the marks that I had transferred over from the pattern. And if you don't generally like pocket placement on button-up shirts, or you have some adjustment that you want to make, you can definitely hold the pattern piece up to your body and then decide where you want the pocket to be placed. You don't have to follow the exact guidelines from the pattern for where to place the pocket. That's what I'm doing here, but it's up to you where you want the pocket placed. The main thing is just to pin the pocket to the front of the shirt and then you can take it to the sewing machine and top stitch it down by sewing around the sides and bottom of the pocket, sewing right along that folded edge of the pocket. So here's what it looks like now that the pocket has been sewn on. Isn't that cute? It's starting to look like an actual shirt. Next up is hemming, and I think it's really cool how in this pattern they do the hemming before sewing the side seams. I typically do it the other way around, but for this pattern I really liked how it worked out doing it this way. I think it was a lot easier with the curved hem to hem it before actually sewing the side seams. So to do this, I have one of my front pieces at the ironing board, and I'm just going to fold up that curved hem of this piece by 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to press it in place with my iron. And then once it's all pressed, I'm going to pin it, and then I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew it with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So basically I'm just going to be sewing straight up the middle of my 1/4 inch folded hem. And now with my first pass of stitching done, I'm going to fold it in again by 1/4 of an inch. So folding it right along the raw edge of my previous fold, and then I'm going to iron it again and then pin it again, and then I'm going to take it back to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch it one more time, this time stitching right along that inner folded edge, as close to the edge as I can get, to make a nice neat hem. So I've repeated that hemming process with the other front as well as with the back piece, and they look really great. I'm really happy with this nice rolled hem. So the next step is going to be to sew the back to the fronts at the shoulder seams, and we're going to be doing this with French seams because we want a beautiful finish inside and out for this shirt. So the first step for sewing these seams with a French seam is to pin the shoulder seams with the wrong sides together. So you got to go against your instincts here and put them wrong sides together, and then pin those shoulder seams, and then take it to the sewing machine and stitch it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're only taking part of our seam allowance right now. We're sewing it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then later we will take the rest of the seam allowance in the next step. Alright, so I've got my first pass of sewing done for the shoulder seams, and now I'm going to trim the seam allowances down a little bit. So I'm going to trim them down to about 1/8 of an inch with my scissors just to reduce bulk in the seam later. And then we will go ahead and take this to the ironing board, and we're going to do a little bit of pressing before our next pass of stitching. So I have my shirt here at my ironing board, and the first thing I need to do is press my seam allowances open to get everything nice and crisp. Once I've got that done, now it's time to flip the shirt so that the right side of the front is together with the right side of the back, So we're basically just doing now what you would have normally done at the beginning and pinning them with right sides together. So I'm going to line up that shoulder seam right sides together and press it with my iron to get it nice and flat. And then I'm going to pin both of these shoulder seams. And then I will take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to be sewing the shoulder seams again, this time right sides together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So this will take our entire seam allowance in this step and it will encase the raw edges inside of that seam. So it'll be really nice and pretty and a beautiful finish. So going forward through this pattern, every time I say that I'm sewing one of the seams with a French seam, this is the process that I'll be going through for that seam. All right, next up, we need to make that adorable little sleeve placket. And this might be one of those parts where if you looked at the pattern instructions, you were like, what in the world is going on here? Because there's so much folding and pressing and stitching, and it's just a little bit wonky how it goes together, but it's super cool how in the end you end up with that adorable sleeve placket. So hopefully I can help you through these steps to make this sleeve placket today. All right, so to start, you're gonna wanna lay one of your sleeves with the wrong side facing up and make sure that you have all those pattern markings drawn in on your sleeve. So that longer line where the placket will go, plus some smaller lines or notches where you will be forming your pleats. And also you will need one of your sleeve placket pieces, and you want to choose the one that can go right sides together with the wrong side of your sleeve, with the longer side of the placket towards the side of the sleeve that has more marks for pleats. And then we want to line up that long line in the center of the rectangle of the placket with the long line that we had drawn onto the wrong side of the sleeve. So I'm just making sure those lines are lined up all the way up, and then I'm just going to pin the placket right sides together with the wrong side of the sleeve. And then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch from the placket side. I'm going to stitch along that rectangle that is marked on the pattern as the dashed lines. So basically this rectangle around that line in the center. All right, so I have that rectangle stitched on here, so the placket is now attached to the sleeve, and now I need to grab my scissors and I'm going to cut up that center line and then also cut from that line towards each of those upper corners of the rectangle that we stitched. And you just want to make sure that you do not cut through your stitching, but that you cut close to your stitching in those upper corners. So now that the placket has been cut open, we need to bring it to the ironing board, and the first thing we're going to do is fold in the outer edge of the placket along the first line, folding it towards the wrong side of the placket and pressing it. And we're going to do that on both sides of the placket, the long side as well as the short side, pressing it along the first line on either side. And with that done, now we can turn the placket to the right side of the sleeve around that slit that we cut and press everything flat. And with that done, now we need to turn the short side of the placket and its seam allowance towards the center of the placket and press it. And then we need to fold it back the other way along the line that's drawn somewhere near the center of the placket. It's not quite in the center, but there should be one line remaining that you can fold it along and press it in place. Then you'll want to pin the short side of the placket, and then we're going to stitch the short side of the placket in place right along the folded edge towards the outside of the sleeve. So the folded edge that's furthest from the center of the placket. Alright, so I've got the short side of the placket stitched down, so we're halfway there, and now we just need to fold in the long side of the placket. So it starts out the same. We're going to fold it towards the center of the placket along with the seam allowance, and we are going to press it nice and flat. Then we're going to fold it back the other way so that it goes back over the seam allowance again and encases it by folding it along the line that's drawn up the center of the long side of the placket. And then we're just going to press all of this nice and flat so that we have a nice flat placket, and we make sure that both sides of the placket line up perfectly. Once we have that pressed, the last thing we need to do is fold in the edges of the top of the long side of the placket to form that nice little triangle at the top. And this just takes some trial and error of folding it in and trying to get it even. It took me a couple tries to get the triangle as even as I could. So just try your best to get the triangle edges along the top folded in as best as you can. Once you've got everything pressed the way that you want it, then just pin your plackets in place. And then we need to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to need to sew up the long outside edge of the longer side of the placket, then across that triangle top of the plackets, down about an inch on the other side, and then back across the top parts of both plackets to secure everything in place. And the most important thing here is just to make sure that you are only catching the shorter side of the placket in the very top part. That little house-shaped part of the stitching line is the only part that should have the shorter side of the placket caught in it. We want to make sure we don't catch the placket that's underneath in the stitching along the long side, since we want to make sure that our placket can open along the bottom of the sleeve. Alrighty, so I have both of my plackets done, so you're just going to want to repeat that same process that we just went through for the other placket. And aren't they just adorable? I just think sleeve plackets are the cutest things ever. I don't know why, but I hope that you find them adorable too. But anyways, now it is time to form the pleats at the base of our sleeves. So I have my pleats marked with notches. So on the shorter side of the sleeve, I'm just going to fold the sleeve at the first outermost notch and fold it in to match up with the innermost notch. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, only on this side we have two sets of pleats. So the outermost notch is going to be folded up, and then I'm going to fold it over to meet up with the notch next to it. Then I'm going to fold at the next notch over and fold there and fold it over to meet up with the innermost notch on that side, and then I'm just going to pin that pleat in place. And we're doing this all from the right side of the fabric. And then we're just going to repeat that same process with the other sleeve, and then take this to the machine and use a long basting stitch to just sew those pleats in place right along the edge of the sleeve. So don't sew over the placket, just sew a long basting stitch just over where those pleats are, just enough to hold them in place until we sew the cuffs on. And after sewing them with the basting stitch, I'm also going to give them a quick press with my iron just to make sure that they are laying flat and nice. So I have some nice pleats basted in, and now it is time to attach the sleeves to the shirt. So we're really starting to form a shirt now. So I'm just going to lay the shirt with the wrong side facing up, with one of the armholes opened up with the shoulder seam at the center. And then I'm going to pin the sleeve wrong sides together to that shoulder and armhole area, matching the notches. So there'll be double notches on one side and a single notch on the other side, so that you can make sure that you get the back of the sleeve with the back of the shirt and the front of the sleeve with the front of the shirt. And then repeat that with the other sleeve, and then just go ahead and sew your French seams like I showed you before to attach your sleeves to the shirt. Alrighty, so both sleeves are now sewn in, so now we can sew the side seams and the underarm seams of this shirt. So we're going to lay out the shirt with the wrong sides together as usual, because we're going to be doing French seams again. And I'm just going to pin the side seams, so I'm going to match up the hems, and I'm going to match up the underarm seams, and then I'm going to continue all the way down that whole underarm of the sleeve and match up the end of the sleeves as well. So we're just going to be sewing the entire underarm seam and side seam all in one pass. So just pin that on both sides and then stitch them together with French seams just like before. Alright, so all that's left are the sleeve cuffs and the collar and then the buttons and buttonholes. So we can now set aside the shirt for now, and we're going to start in on the sleeve cuffs. So I'm going to pin one interfaced sleeve cuff to each of the non-interfaced sleeve cuffs with right sides together. And I'm just going to pin along that long curved edge. So we're going to be leaving the upper edge unpinned. And once I have it pinned, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew that long curved edge with my sewing machine with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm also going to make sure to leave 3/4 of an inch unsewn along each end of the cuffs. So the top edges will not be attached until 3/4 of an inch down. So I have my cuffs sewn together, and now we're going to start attaching them to the ends of the sleeve. So I'm going to grab my sleeve here, and I'm going to pin the right side of the non-interfaced side of the sleeve cuff along that top raw edge of the wrong side of one of the sleeves. So you're going to have to fold the interfaced side down and out of the way so that it doesn't get caught in your pinning or your stitching. And the sleeve cuff is going to overhang the ends of the sleeve by 5/8 of an inch. So you want to measure and make sure that the overhang is 5/8 of an inch. And once you get the sleeve cuff pinned around that entire edge of the sleeve, then you're going to take it to the sewing machine and just stitch it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the raw edge at the end of the sleeve. Once we get the sleeve cuff sewn to the end of the sleeve, now we can press the sleeve cuff up and away from the sleeve. So I'm going to pull that sleeve cuff up, and then I'm going to press the cuff flat, and I'm going to also press the seam allowance up towards the cuff. The interfaced part of the sleeve cuff, though, we are going to keep flat for now, so we're only pressing the seam allowance of the part that we sewed. With the cuff pressed, now I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom of the interface side of the cuff and pin it in place, and I'm just going to finish stitching the sides of the cuffs together down to where there's only going to be 5/8 of an inch overhang remaining, and this is just going to keep our seam allowance that we pressed upwards nice and secure for the next step. With that done, now I'm going to trim my seam allowances down to about 1/4 of an inch to reduce bulk. I'm going to do that all the way around my sleeve cuff. Then I'm going to turn my sleeve cuff right sides out and press everything nice and flat. Once I get everything pressed nice and flat, then I can fold up the interfaced side of the cuff by 5/8 of an inch, tucking the raw edges to the inside and pinning everything in place, just making sure that all the stitching lines and raw edges are covered by that folded edge. Then I'm going to take my cuff to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch all the way around the cuff about 1/8 of an inch from the edge to secure everything in place. Then just repeat that whole process to put on the other cuff, and then we're ready to move on to the collar. So to start with the collar, we're going to pin the two collar pieces right sides together along that long curved edge. And we're going to sew them together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance along that long curved edge. With that sewn, now I'm going to trim down my seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to notch the curved areas of the seam allowance. Once I've got that done, I'll turn the collar right sides out, press it with my iron, and then I'm going to top stitch close to that seam that we just sewed to make everything stay nice and crisp. Next, we need to attach the collar to the collar stands. So I'm going to pin the collar stands right sides together, and I'm going to sandwich the collar in between the two collar stands. I'm going to have the top edge of the collar matching up with the curved edges of the collar stands, and I'm going to make sure that the interfaced side of the collar stand is against the interface side of the collar. And it's okay that the collar stand hangs out over the edges of the collar. That is what we want. The collar should be smaller than the collar stands. And then I'm going to stitch the collar stands along that long curved edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to leave 5/8 inch on either end unstitched. With that done, once again, I'm going to trim my seam allowances down to about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to notch the curved areas of the seam allowance. It's all about reducing bulk so that when I turn it right sides out, it will look nice and crisp. With the collar stand turned right sides out, and I've also pressed it with my iron, we now can attach the collar to the shirt. So this is going to be very similar to how we attached the sleeve cuffs. So we're going to pin to the wrong side of the shirt. We're going to pin the right side of the uninterfaced side of the collar stand. And it's very important that we match up the edge of the folded seam allowance on the collar stand with the edge of the button placket on the shirt. So I'm just going to pin the uninterfaced edge of the collar stand right sides together to the wrong side of the neckline all the way around. And once I've got it pinned, I'm just going to take it to my machine and sew the collar stand to the neckline with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, just being very careful not to catch the interface side of the collar stand in my stitching. Now with the uninterfaced side of the collar stand attached, it's time for some more pressing. But first, I wanted to once again trim my seam allowances to reduce bulk. So we're going to press the collar up and away from the neckline of the shirt and press the seam allowance of the uninterfaced side up towards the collar stand. So this is where it gets quite similar to what we did with the sleeve cuffs. So we're pressing the seam allowances up, making sure everything is nice and crisp. Then we can fold 5/8 inch of the interfaced collar stand up and under to hide all the raw edges and the stitching inside that folded edge. So this is very, very much similar to what we did with the sleeve cuffs. So we're just folding in 5/8 inch all the way along that lower edge of the interface side of the collar stand, and then I'm going to pin it in place. Once I have that done, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm just going to top stitch around the edges of the collar stand. So all the way around the collar stand, I'm going to sew about 1/8 inch from the edges to secure everything in place and make sure the collar will be nice and crisp. And once you've got your collar done, all that's left to do is to mark your buttonholes and your buttons, sew in your buttonholes, and sew on your buttons, and then your shirt is done. Alright, so we are done, and you can see it is not as scary as it seems, so I hope that you are feeling confident and ready to take on your own button-up shirt. And of course, everything that I use to make this shirt will be tagged down below, so if you want to make a shirt just like the one that I made, you can check that out and add all those items to cart and get it as a kit. Or if you want more inspiration for the Melilot shirt pattern, you can go ahead and click on the product page for the pattern, which, like I said, is linked down below. And then you can scroll through posts from other people who may have sewn up this shirt and see some other photos of this shirt made up in different fabrics so that you can get some good inspiration. Alright, so I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we would love to hear what you think, and if you have any questions about this project, go ahead and leave those in the comments and I will try my best to help you out. And of course, if you do sew up this shirt, we would love to see your project. You can create a profile and then post some pictures of your project to your profile, and then you can link the fabric and the pattern that you used. We would love to see your projects. So happy sewing!